My name is Teju Cole, and I'm a Nigerian and an American. I'm a writer and a photographer, and I want to talk a little bit about the intersection between writing, photography, about some of the ways of thinking about photography. Can everybody hear me? Am I clear? All right. Um, I think the first thing I want to think about is what I think we have a pretty good idea of what photography is at this point. I think one decent definition of what photography is a kind of image making made with light directly from an object that is in some way able to be registered and sustained. So if you cast a shadow on something and the shadow can last longer than the body cast in the shadow, that's pretty much photography, writing with light. I think a little bit more complicated is the question of what's a photographer, because of the kinds of artistic changes that have happened in the understanding of that term. So I, for example, I'm a novelist, I'm an art historian, I'm a photographer, I also write about photography. And one of the things that, I'm just going to go back. Does it work? Okay. Technical issues. But you've got that beautiful PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, fine. When I'm writing photography essays, for example, I recently wrote one for the Times that was about a number of artists who are using photography in an appropriation-based sense. And I really wanted to think about what Penelope Umbrico was doing in Joachim Schmid, where they take other people's photos from the internet. And to me, in writing that, I'm working as a writer. But more recently, and later in this talk, I'll touch on it, I started to think through some of those issues again, but using images. And for me, that is not a writerly practice, that's a photographic practice. So that's me working as a photographer. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about more old-fashioned approaches. So, you know those people who still sort of run around with cameras, taking pictures of things? Those people are photographers too. I mean, this is a very sophisticated audience, so we sometimes forget about them. I'm working on a book of photographs about Switzerland, so I've been thinking about landscape a lot. Switzerland, I know it's really sexy. It's very, very exciting. But it's precisely about digging into it and finding out what is exciting about it, why people think, oh, that's done. That's why I'm doing a project about it. And so I've been thinking about what is it in a landscape that expresses itself through photographic work. So if you look at this image, which some of you might recognize, a tract house in Colorado, probably in the 70s, by Robert Adams, we are somewhat invested in this idea of the photographer as the singular genius who imposes himself or herself on what the landscape wants. But as I'm trying to sort through what a landscape involves, I start to sort of get this idea that there is something that the landscape wants that ends up being expressed through the photography, through the photographer against his will or her will. And so I feel like the crisp, descriptive, sort of sober kind of photography that Robert Adams does with the expanding American settlements in the West is as much his work as it is what the landscape wants. And if you look at David Goldblatt working on apartheid-era churches in South Africa, the Dutch Reformed Church, it almost seems as if there's something about the aggressively neutral style that is itself a kind of reaction to this landscape of formalized terror that apartheid was. And meanwhile, somebody like Giri, so this is sort of the people I go to and try to understand what is their landscape saying to them. Luigi Giri, who's from Emilia-Romagna, whose work is always sort of like in between this region of what is fiction and what is fact, what is constructed, what is natural. And I think there's something in his soft color that is responding to that landscape, a landscape that contains castles, but also contains advertising and billboards. And I want to contrast him to somebody like Eggleston, who is his contemporary. They admired each other, but in the case of Eggleston shooting in the American South, William Eggleston talks about angry reds, and he has these angry reds and these vivid blues and this very sometimes violent greens. And it seems to me that that landscape, it's not just about how brightly the sun shines there, but something about the very fraught political situation of the southern United States at this time. And for me, it's like the evidence for this kind of argument is actually in the photographs themselves, trying to understand it as a practitioner, saying it's not impossible to shoot like David Goldblatt and shoot in the South in that way, but that is not necessarily what the landscape is eliciting from you. And William Christenbury, very similar to Eggleston in this way, who has always gone back to Hale County, Alabama. And there's something of that. There's something I think of as a vernacular American Southern color, almost as specific as regional cuisine. And yet if you take somebody like Felicitas Wöckler, who's a German photographer who worked a lot in Greece, something about that landscape, which has a kind of a rough hewness to it, but also a kind of Euclidean geometrical regularity. And that leads to one kind of photography. And if you think of Rinko Kawauchi, the contemporary Japanese photographer, whose work is dealing so much with evanescence and things that are unsteady and just sort of on the edge of your vision. And these are things that are being given to her by her landscape, and of course the culture that has shaped that landscape. So that was sort of like more the formal, the photographer, old-fashioned style of it. But then as I thought about this more, I started to think about other kinds of landscapes, such as, for example, this stairwell, which I have regrammed onto my Instagram account from somebody who put it up on Instagram. And then somebody else made the same stairwell, and then somebody else made the same. And then somebody else made the same. Why are they all taking the same fucking stairwell? What's going on? It's because when you go into the new museum in New York, you go into that stairwell and the stairwell says, take a picture of me, but you have to take it in exactly this way. And each person who does it, says, oh, I'm being so original, It's such a cool picture. And I start to think of this as sort of like the affordances of that particular terrain. There are possibilities and there are restrictions. There's a wall here and there's a view here. And these things start to suggest to you that maybe you should do the work in a particular way. And this is a combination of architecture and landscape that does these things. So that was a fun project to put on Instagram. I really freaked people out. I lost like 100 followers a day. They're like, what is he doing? He's so obsessed. But I was working through this idea of the good photograph, but actually it's a kind of repetition because the landscape is almost determining what people do. So that if you go to Columbus Circle and you go to the Museum of Art and Design at MAD, somehow everybody who goes there makes these same images. And in a way, this is even more insightful. It's more direct in a way than a good photographer, a formal photographer, a great photographer trying to impose himself or herself on the landscape. If you go to One World Observatory, everybody who goes there, and these repetitions, it's not quite mystical. It is actually, it's just the boundaries, it's the borders that are created by the space that you're in. So for me, this becomes an opening into a photographic practice. This is the Natural History Museum. Everybody, the same spot, because we have some kind of embedded notion of what a good photograph looks like. But now social photography makes visible what for so long has been hidden. And then there's So that's general idea. 10 minutes goes by really fast. There's so much I want to talk to you about, but I think Mina's going to come out here and ask me one or two questions. Anyway, that's, and I think of this as the affordances of terrain, because affordance is a sociological concept, but I think terrain has things that it suggests and that it makes possible.
So, Teju, simple question actually.
Sure.
Maybe too easy for you. Why landscape? Why you choose landscape? You mean with the same tools but different perspective, you can send different message to or different stories about one place. Why you choose landscape?
I mean, I think landscape became important for my own thinking in photography, in part because I was traveling so much and trying to understand how each place sort of expresses itself. The reality about the world is that most places are actually the same. Every airport looks the same, and restaurants look the same, and cafes. But landscape remains a sort of distinctive reality in the world. You cross over from Switzerland into Italy, and it's a different landscape. It's kind of weird. So,
great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thanks.